Blood was still wet on the mahogany when the ice water hit. The sound that followed wasn't a gasp or a scream. It was the collective inhale of 50 people who understood they were watching either a murder or a miracle. Caspian Volkov stood in the center of the Crimson Lounge's VIP section, drenched from his $2,000 haircut to his $6,000 Brioni suit, the kind of cold that makes bones ache spreading across his skin. Water dripped from his jawline from the scar that ran temple to chin like a signature left by a knife that had meant to kill him and failed. His ice-blue eyes, the kind that made grown men check their life insurance, blinked once, twice. The waitress who had done the impossible stood 3 feet away, holding an empty ice bucket like it was a serving tray and not a weapon of social suicide. Her name was Marlo Ashford, though nobody in this room knew that yet, and her hands were steady even as her heart tried to punch through her sternum. She'd spent 24 years learning that fear was just another kind of currency, and tonight she'd cashed in every cent. The bottle of Stolichnaya that Caspian had been about to use as a bludgeon sat on the table between them, already forgotten. Marlo reached for it without breaking eye contact, lifted it with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd served 800 tables in 3 years, and placed it firmly on the lacquered surface. The sound of glass meeting wood echoed in the silence. Her voice came out level, almost bored, the way you'd speak to a child throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. "Sit down, drink water, you're acting like a child." She turned to the bar, grabbed a glass, filled it from the tap. Not the filtered pitcher, not the sparkling mineral water that cost $18 a bottle. Just Chicago, municipal tap water that probably had more copper than the pipes it came through. She set it in front of Caspian Volkov, heir to the most brutal crime family in the Midwest, and turned her back on him. Every survival instinct she'd honed in Ezra Ashford's house, where wrong answers meant flying fists and right answers meant silence, screamed that she'd just signed her own death warrant. But she kept walking, shoes clicking against imported Italian marble, past the poker tables where men in 5-figure watches had stopped mid-deal, past the lounge, where women who cost more per hour than Marlo made in a week stared with something between horror and admiration. She made it 6 steps before she heard the sound that would change everything. Caspian Volkov sat down. The leather of the booth exhaled under his weight. Glass touched lips. He drank the tap water in 3 long swallows, throat working, and when he set the empty glass down, the entire room seemed to remember how to breathe. Marlo didn't look back. She walked straight to the service bar, where Yuri was cradling his broken wrist bone, jutting at an angle that made her stomach turn, and she grabbed her purse from under the register. Her shift was over. It had been over the moment she'd made her choice, though she wouldn't understand the full weight of that choice until dawn broke over Lake Michigan and 4 black SUVs blocked her route home. The Crimson Lounge smelled like every high-end establishment Marlo had ever worked, expensive cologne, trying to mask the cheaper stink of desperation. Leather seats absorbing decades of deals made and broken, and underneath it all, the copper tang of violence waiting to happen. She'd clocked in at 6 that evening. November cold seeping through her coat until the kitchen's heat had thawed her fingers enough to carry trays. The tips had been good, $180 in her apron by the time Caspian Volkov walked through the door at 11. She should have known. The Tales were there, security sweeping the room first. Conversations dying in concentric circles, the manager Paulie actually buttoning his collar and straightening his tie. But Marlo had been running the numbers in her head, the same brutal arithmetic that governed every waking moment. Rent due in 6 days, $900. Jasper's prescription copay, $240. Groceries if she wanted to eat something other than ramen, maybe $80 if she was lucky. And underneath all of it, the number that turned her stomach into a fist, $70,000 for a bone marrow transplant that would give her 16-year-old brother a chance at seeing 17. She'd had $420 in her checking account that morning. The math didn't work. It never worked. Caspian had walked in like weather, the kind you don't argue with or try to change. 6'1", moving with the loose economy of someone who'd never had to watch their back, because everyone else was too busy watching theirs. He wore violence the way other men wore cologne. The scar on his face wasn't the kind you got in a bar fight. It was surgical, deliberate, the signature of someone who'd wanted him to remember. He'd snapped his fingers, actually snapped them like Marlowe was a dog instead of a person, and his voice had cut through the jazz piano. Vodka, now. Yuri, the bartender who'd been there 8 years and thought that gave him the right to grab Marlowe's wrist when she passed too close, had shoved a bottle into her hands without looking. She'd carried it to Caspian's table on a silver tray, her reflection warping in the metal, and she'd placed it beside his hand with the practiced neutrality of someone who'd learned early that attention was dangerous. He'd looked at the label. His jaw had tightened, the muscle jumping beneath skin that probably cost a fortune to maintain. When he spoke, his voice had dropped an octave into something that made her vertebrae want to fuse. "I said Russian Standard Platinum." Marlowe had glanced at the bottle. "Stolichnaya. Wrong brand, wrong tier, wrong everything." She'd opened her mouth to apologize, to offer to bring the correct bottle, to do what she'd done 1,000 times before and smooth over someone else's mistake with her own deference. Then Yuri's voice had cracked across the room like a whip. "She grabbed the wrong bottle. I told her platinum she brought Stoli." The lie was so casual it almost sounded true. Marlowe had felt something cold settle in her chest, the same feeling she got when Ezra came home with that particular glaze in his eyes that meant he'd lost again, lost big, and someone was going to pay for it. Caspian had stood. The bottle had been in his hand, and then it was glass shrapnel on marble, the crash loud enough to make 3 people flinch. He'd grabbed Yuri's wrist before the bartender could backpedal, and the sound of bone breaking was quieter than Marlowe expected, more of a pop than a crack, like green wood bending too far. Yuri's scream had been anything but quiet. Caspian had released him, let him crumple against the bar, clutching his ruined wrist, and then those ice-chip eyes had found Marlowe. She'd watched him cross the distance between them. Watched every single person in the VIP section suddenly find something fascinating about their drinks or their phones or the middle distance, and she'd understood with perfect clarity that this was the moment. The one where you either bent or broke. His hand had come up. The backhand had caught her across the cheekbone with enough force to make her stumble, and the pain had been bright and clean and familiar enough to trigger every defense mechanism Ezra Ashford had beaten into her nervous system. Don't cry. Don't cower. Don't give them what they want. She'd straightened tasted copper and touched the locket at her throat. The metal was warm from her skin. Inside was a picture of her mother dead from breast cancer 4 years ago, while Ezra gambled away the treatment money, and beside it a recent photo of Jasper, his smile too big for his chemo-thin face. Caspian had raised his hand again. Marlowe's fingers had closed around the ice bucket on the nearest table. The rational part of her brain, the part that had kept her alive in Ezra's house and kept food on the table through 3 minimum-wage jobs, had screamed that this was suicide, that you didn't humiliate men like Caspian Volkov and wake up breathing, that her brother needed her alive, not martyred. But there was another part, the part that had been swallowing indignities for tips and smiling, while men twice her age made comments about what they'd like to do if she wasn't working, and that part was done. That part had looked at Caspian's raised hand and thought, not today. She'd lifted the bucket. Ice and water, probably 5 pounds of it, the kind of cold that shocks the nervous system. She'd thrown it with both hands, a full-body motion that sent freezing water and half-melted ice directly into Caspian Volkov's face. Now, walking toward the exit with her purse clutched against her ribs, Marlowe waited for the bullet, for hands grabbing her from behind, for something. Nothing came. She pushed through the double doors into November air that bit through her thin coat, and she kept walking. Her car was parked 4 blocks away in a lot that charged $8 for the privilege of not getting towed. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a text from Jasper asking if she'd be home tonight or if he should take his pills alone, and she wanted to throw up. The street was empty except for a homeless man warming his hands over a burning trash can and a couple arguing in Russian outside a closed bodega. Marlowe's breath came out in clouds. Her cheek throbbed where Caspian had struck her, and she knew from experience it would bruise purple by morning. She'd made it 2 blocks when the headlights found her. 4 black SUVs, Escalades, probably the kind with bulletproof glass and suspension that cost more than she'd make in 5 years. They moved in formation, smooth and practiced, and they boxed her in against a brick wall covered in graffiti, advertising a club that had closed in 2019. Marlowe's hand went to her purse. Inside was a can of pepper spray that was probably expired and a folding knife her mother had given her at 16 with the advice, aim for the soft parts and run. Neither would do a damn thing against whatever was about to happen. The rear door of the center SUV opened. An old man stepped out, moving carefully, one hand on a cane topped with a silver wolf's head that caught the streetlight and threw it back. He wore a cashmere overcoat that probably cost what Marlowe paid in rent for 6 months, and his face was all angles and sharp edges, the kind that age had weathered but not softened. His eyes, when they met hers, were the same ice blue as his son's. Victor Volkov didn't smile. He didn't threaten. He simply gestured toward the open car door. "Miss Ashford, we should talk." The fact that he knew her name made Marlowe's throat tight. She hadn't given it to anyone at the Crimson Lounge. Her name tag said Mara because Paulie couldn't spell and she'd never bothered to correct him. 8 men materialized from the other vehicles. Large men in dark suits with the kind of stillness that suggested military training. They didn't draw weapons. They didn't need to. The message was clear: you can get in the car voluntarily or involuntarily, but you're getting in the car. Marlowe thought about running, about screaming, about all the useless things people did when they were outmatched and knew it. Instead, she climbed into the SUV. The interior smelled like leather and gun oil. Victor settled across from her, arranging his legs carefully, and the door closed with the kind of solid thunk that said nothing was getting in or out without permission. The driver pulled away from the curb, smooth as silk, and Marlowe watched her escape routes disappear in the side mirror. Victor tapped his wolf head cane against the floor, a rhythmic sound that might have been thoughtful or might have been a tell. When he spoke, his accent was there, but polished, the kind that suggested money and education alongside the brutality. "Yuri told my people you gave the wrong vodka. My son says you gave the right vodka, and Yuri lied to save himself. Which is it?" Marlowe met his eyes. Lying would be stupid. Men like Victor Volkov had been reading deception since before she was born. "The security camera above the bar will show Yuri handed me Stolichnaya, but I should have checked the label before I served it." Something flickered in Victor's expression there and gone. Accountability. Rare quality. He shifted his weight, the cane moving with him. "But that's not why you're here. You spoke to my son like an equal. Nobody does that." "Why?" The SUV turned onto Lakeshore Drive, heading north away from Marlowe's apartment and her brother and anything resembling safety. She forced her hands to stay still in her lap, forced her voice to stay level. "My father drinks. When he's drunk, he hits. I learned early: show fear and you get hit harder. Show strength and they pause. Your father is Ezra Ashford." Victor said it like a fact, not a question. "He owes the Odessa organization $52,000. Currently hiding in Gary, Indiana in a motel that rents by the hour. Your brother Jasper has acute lymphoblastic leukemia stage 3. Needs a bone marrow transplant. Cost is approximately $70,000. Your insurance through the Crimson Lounge covers nothing. You have $420 in your checking account and $63 in savings." He paused. Let that sink in. "You want to know how I know all this?" Marlowe's throat had gone dry. "You do background checks on waitresses." "I do background checks on everyone who enters my son's orbit." Victor leaned forward slightly. "Your mother was Maria DeLuca before she married. She left New York at 19, changed her name, cut all ties with her family. Smart woman. The DeLucas were competitors of ours. Most of them are dead now, but blood is blood." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Marlowe forced herself to breathe, to think through the panic. "My mother never spoke about her family. She died when I was 18. I don't know anything about—" "I know." Victor's interruption was almost gentle. "She protected you, kept you clean, but blood has a way of surfacing." He sat back, the leather creaking. "My son is a weapon with a broken safety. 16 handlers have quit in the past 10 months. He breaks them, fires them, or they leave because they value their lives more than money. He respects no one, listens to no one." The cane tapped again. "But he listened to you." Marlowe's pulse hammered against her wrists. "I made him angry. You made him pause. There's a difference." Victor reached into his coat and pulled out a folded envelope, cream-colored paper that probably cost more per sheet than Marlowe made in an hour. I'm offering you a position, handler for my son. Your job is to keep him functional during business hours, sober, punctual, and not killing anyone who doesn't deserve it. 6 months. $10,000 a week cash. I'll clear your father's debt as a signing bonus. $70,000 advance for your brother's treatment. The numbers hit like fists. $10,000 a week was $240,000 over 6 months, more money than Marlowe had ever conceived of having, enough to bury the debts that had been drowning her since her mother died. Enough to save Jasper. She found her voice. If he touches me in anger, you have my permission to use the ice bucket again. Victor smiled, and it was worse than his neutral expression. It's in the contract. Physical retaliation for physical assault. Self-defense is legal even in our world. The SUV pulled up into a building Marlowe recognized from the skyline, all glass and steel, and the kind of real estate that existed in a different economic universe. The door opened, letting in cold air and city sounds. Victor extended the envelope. You have 5 minutes to decide. After that we drive away, and you never hear from us again. Your father's debt remains. Your brother's clock keeps ticking. He checked his watch, an understated piece that probably cost more than a car. Choose. Marlowe took the envelope. Inside was a contract, single page, the terms exactly as Victor had stated. At the bottom, a line for her signature. She thought about Jasper, about the way his hands shook now when he tried to hold a fork, about the texts he sent at 2 in the morning when the pain was bad and he was scared, about Ezra, who'd gambled away her mother's life and was currently drinking himself to death in a $10 motel room. She thought about the look on Caspian's face when the ice water hit, that split second of pure shock that said someone had finally treated him like he wasn't a god. Marlowe pulled a pen from her purse and signed her name. Victor took the contract back, folded it carefully, and tucked it away. Your brother's treatment is pre-authorized as of tomorrow morning. Northwestern Memorial Dr. Sarah Chen, best transplant surgeon in the Midwest. Your father's debt is cleared. I'll have the documentation delivered to the Odessa bosses by noon. You start at 7 a.m. He handed her a key card, black plastic with a room number embossed in gold. Penthouse level east wing, your apartment, furnished. You'll receive your first payment Friday. The door closed. The SUV pulled away, leaving Marlowe standing on the sidewalk with a key card in one hand and her entire life rewritten in the span of 10 minutes. She looked up at the building, 42 floors of glass reflecting the city back at itself. Somewhere in there was Caspian Volkov, the man she'd just agreed to babysit for money that felt like blood. Her phone buzzed. Jasper. You coming home tonight? I'm getting bad again. Marlowe texted back. I'll be there in an hour. Hold on. She walked to the nearest L station, took the red line south to Pilsen, and climbed 4 flights to the studio apartment she shared with her brother. Jasper was asleep on the fold-out couch, his medication bottles lined up on the table like chess pieces. She sat beside him, careful not to wake him, and touched his forehead. Still warm, not feverish yet. Tomorrow she'd tell him about Northwestern Memorial, about Dr. Chen and bone marrow and a chance at living past 17. Tonight she just sat there in the dark, listening to her brother breathe, and wondered what she'd actually sold for $70,000. Sleep didn't come. At 6 a.m. she showered, dressed in the cleanest clothes she owned, and took a cab she couldn't afford back to the glass tower. The keycard worked. The elevator recognized it and took her to the 42nd floor without requiring additional input. The apartment was 3 times the size of the place she'd just left. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Lake Michigan, the water gray and restless under morning clouds. The furniture was leather and chrome, the kind that looked uncomfortable and probably cost a fortune. In the bedroom, someone had left a suit, black, tailored her size, exactly hanging in the closet beside 4 more just like it. On the kitchen counter sat a folder. Inside, Caspian's schedule for the next month, a list of contacts and a handwritten note in Victor's precise script: keep him alive, keep him functional. Everything else is negotiable. Marlowe made coffee from the espresso machine that probably cost more than her car, and waited. At 7:15 her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered. Yes. Victor's voice. Penthouse suite 43rd floor. Bring coffee. He'll be in a mood. The line went dead. Marlowe took the espresso, stepped back into the elevator, and rose one more floor. The doors opened directly into a living space that made her apartment look like a closet. Caspian was doing one-armed push-ups in the center of the room, shirtless, his back a roadmap of scars and ink that told stories she didn't want to read. He didn't stop when she entered. She counted 40 push-ups before he paused, sweat gleaming on skin, and looked at her with those ice-chip eyes. Recognition dawned slowly, then sharpened. His voice was rough from exertion. "The Ice Queen. My father said he hired a handler. I thought he was joking when he said it was the waitress." Marlowe set the espresso on the granite counter. "Executive assistant. And it's Marlowe." Caspian pushed himself upright, grabbed a towel, and closed the distance between them. He invaded her personal space deliberately, using his height to loom testing. Up close, she could smell sweat, and the ghost of expensive cologne from yesterday could see the way the scar tissue pulled tight when he clenched his jaw. "Let me be clear," he said, and his voice had dropped into that dangerous register. "You don't work for me. You're a spy for my father, a babysitter. I don't need a babysitter." Marlowe held his gaze. "Based on last night, you need a muzzle." His jaw tightened. "You got lucky. Caught me off guard. Don't think you can talk to me like that here." "Is that a threat?" She kept her voice level, conversational. "Because your father was very specific about the terms of my employment. If I quit because you're difficult, he handles you himself. Do you want Victor breathing down your neck, or do you want to deal with me?" Caspian stared at her. The silence stretched taut as wire. Then, "What do you know about scheduling?" "I managed a diner during lunch rush with a broken register and a cook on meth. I can handle your calendar." He scoffed, turned away to pour himself a drink. 10 in the morning, and he was reaching for vodka. Marlowe moved before he could uncap the bottle, stepping between him and the bar. "Put it down." Caspian went very still. "Excuse me. Your schedule says you have a meeting with union representatives at 11. You need to be sharp. If you walk in smelling like vodka, they'll think you're weak." She met his eyes. "Are you weak?" For 5 seconds she thought he might hit her. His hand twitched toward the bottle, then away. The muscle in his jaw jumped. Then he slammed the glass down, not the bottle, just the glass, and it shattered against the granite. "I am not weak." "Then drink coffee." Marlowe walked past him to the espresso machine, started another shot. "Shower. Put on the gray suit, not the black. Black makes you look like you're attending a funeral. We want them to trust you, not fear you today." She handed him the espresso, watched him take it with hands that weren't quite steady, and thought, this is going to be a very long 6 months. Caspian drank the coffee in 2 swallows, slammed the cup down hard enough to chip the saucer, and stalked toward the bathroom. At the door he paused. "You're annoying." "I'm expensive. There's a difference." She kept her tone light, professional. 5 minutes, or I'm coming in there with a hose." He stopped, turned, and for just a second the corner of his mouth twitched. Not a smile, nothing that generous, but something adjacent to amusement. Then he disappeared into the bathroom, and Marlowe heard the shower start. She exhaled, gripping the counter until her knuckles ached. 1 interaction down, 6 months to go. The coffee had gone cold in her hands by the time Caspian emerged, dressed in charcoal gray that fit him like a threat, his hair still damp. He looked at her at the fresh espresso she'd made, and something in his expression shifted. Not warmth, not trust, but maybe the beginning of curiosity. "The car leaves in 20 minutes, Marlowe said. "Union reps don't like to be kept waiting." Caspian took the cup, drank, and nodded once. "Let's go." They rode the elevator in silence. In the lobby, 2 bodyguards fell into step behind them, and outside a black Mercedes waited at the curb. Marlowe climbed in, and Caspian slid in beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat coming off him. The car pulled into traffic. Through the tinted windows, Chicago scrolled past a city Marlowe had lived in her whole life, but had never really seen from this angle, elevated and insulated by bulletproof glass and money. Caspian spoke without looking at her. "My father told you about my mother." It wasn't a question. Marlowe chose her words carefully. "He said she died when you were young." "Car bomb. Meant for him." She was in the wrong place. His voice was flat factual. I was 11. After that, I learned not to trust anyone. Marlowe touched the locket at her throat, felt the weight of her own ghosts. My mother died of cancer when I was 18. My father gambled away her treatment money. I learned not to trust him with anything that mattered. Caspian looked at her, then really looked, and something passed between them, not understanding exactly, but recognition. Two people shaped by dead mothers and surviving fathers who'd failed them. "How's your brother?" The question was quiet, almost gentle. "Scared, in pain, running out of time." Marlowe's throat tightened. "But as of this morning, he's on the transplant list at Northwestern, because of your father's money." "Because of you," Caspian corrected. "You threw ice water in my face. That took balls." The Mercedes pulled up to a warehouse in River North gray concrete and no windows. The bodyguards got out first, scanned the area, then opened the door. Caspian stepped out and Marlowe followed. Inside, 8 men sat around a table. Union representatives, dock workers with hands like hammers and eyes that had seen decades of broken promises. They stood when Caspian entered, and the air went tight. Marlowe hung back watching as Caspian took the head of the table, as he shook hands with a grip that was firm, but not crushing, as he spoke in a voice that carried authority without menace. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. A contract was signed, $5 million changing hands in exchange for labor peace on the South Side docks. When they emerged, Caspian looked at Marlowe and nodded. "You were right. Gray was the right choice." "I'm usually right about clothes," Marlowe said. "And vodka. And ice water." This time he actually smiled. Small, sharp, but real. They drove back to the tower in silence that felt less hostile, more thoughtful. And Marlowe thought maybe, just maybe, this could work. She had no idea that in 72 hours someone would try to kill Viktor Volkov and her entire world would catch fire. The call came at 2 in the morning on Marlowe's third day as Caspian's keeper, her phone vibrating against the glass nightstand until she grabbed it half asleep. Victor's voice cut through the fog. "Penthouse cellar. Now, bring your brain." The line went dead before she could ask questions. Marlowe, dressed in yesterday's clothes, still creased from where she'd collapsed on top of the bed, and took the elevator down 3 floors to a level that hadn't appeared on any building directory she'd seen. The doors opened onto temperature-controlled darkness, the kind of cold that wrapped around your lungs and squeezed. Victor stood between rows of wine racks that stretched into shadows backlit by dim amber lights that made the bottles glow like captured stars. He didn't turn when she approached, just gestured with the wolf head cane toward the collection. 400 bottles, combined value approximately $2 million. Macallan, 1926, Pappy Van Winkle 23-year Japanese whiskey from distilleries that no longer exist. My son's inheritance or part of it. Marlowe's exhaustion sharpened into focus. "What am I looking at? 3 of these are fake. Very good fakes. They've fooled 8 supposed experts over the past decade. You have 30 minutes to find them." Victor checked his watch, the face catching the low light. "Fail, and our contract ends. Your brother's treatment gets pulled. Your father's debt resurfaces." The floor seemed to tilt. Marlowe steadied herself against a rack, the wood cool under her palm. "I'm a waitress, not a sommelier. You're Maria DeLuca's daughter. Your mother worked at Domenico's Imports for 6 years before she met your father. She had an eye for quality that made the family a fortune in the wine trade before she walked away." Victor finally looked at her, those ice-chip eyes reflecting nothing. "The question is whether she taught you anything before the cancer took her." The memory surfaced unbidden, her mother's hands thin from chemotherapy, holding a bottle up to kitchen light. Teaching Marlowe to read labels the way other mothers taught their daughters to read music. The weight of liquid, the color through glass, the way authentic wax seals cracked versus how modern forgeries peeled. Maria had made it a game during the bad months, a distraction from pain that was eating her alive from the inside. Marlowe took the notebook Victor offered, the magnifying glass, the UV light that cast everything in sickly purple. She started at the far end of the cellar where the oldest bottles gathered dust that nobody was allowed to disturb. Her mother's voice echoed across 4 years of silence. "Details lie. Numbers lie. But physics doesn't." The Macallan 1926 stopped her on the third row. The label was perfect serif font correct spacing, even the slight discoloration from age looked authentic. But when Marlowe held the UV light close, the paper didn't fluoresce. Pre-1950 labels used cotton fiber paper that absorbed ultraviolet. Modern reproductions used wood pulp that glowed faint blue under the right wavelength. She marked it in the notebook, felt Victor watching from the shadows. The second fake revealed itself through weight. Pappy Van Winkle. 23-year vintage felt wrong in her hands. Not dramatically so, just a fraction too light, like someone had filled it with diluted alcohol instead of the real thing. Marlowe cracked the wax seal, breathing in the smell. Her mother had taught her that bourbon carried vanilla and caramel notes, oak and char from barrels that had held the liquid for decades. This smelled right, but the viscosity was off when she tilted the bottle. Real Pappy clung to glass like honey. This moved like water pretending to be whiskey. She marked it, checked the timer Victor had set on the table. 18 minutes gone. The third fake made her work for it. She'd eliminated 100 bottles, checked seals and weights and label fonts until her eyes ached from the magnifying glass. Then she found the Stolichnaya Elite, and something cold settled in her chest. The bottle sat innocuous among Russian vodkas that probably cost more than cars, and there was no reason it should have caught her attention except for the weight. She lifted it, felt the liquid shift, and remembered Elite was 40% alcohol by volume, which gave it specific gravity different from water. This bottle was too light by maybe an ounce. Marlowe opened it, poured a capful, touched her tongue to the liquid. Vodka should burn clean, no aftertaste, just pure ethanol stripped of everything except the punch. This had been cut with something water, probably to stretch the real product and pocket the difference. She wrote it down with 3 minutes to spare, then stood back and waited for Victor's verdict. He walked the rows slowly, checking her marked bottles against his own knowledge. At the Macallan he nodded. At the Pappy his mouth twitched into something that might have been approval. At the Elite he stopped. "How did you know?" "Weight first, then taste. Someone diluted it, probably 10% water by volume. Changes the specific gravity enough that you can feel the difference if you're paying attention." Victor picked up the bottle, held it to the light, then looked at Marlowe with an expression she couldn't parse. In 10 years, 8 experts failed this test. Sommeliers with credentials from France, wine brokers who'd forgotten more than most people learn. You found all 3 in under 30 minutes. He walked to a cabinet, pulled out a checkbook that looked like it had never been used for anything less than 6 figures, and wrote with strokes that suggested military precision. He tore the check free and handed it to Marlowe, $70,000 drawn on an account she didn't recognize. "Your brother's treatment is pre-authorized. Northwestern Memorial Dr. Chen's team. They'll call you tomorrow morning." Victor folded his hands over the wolf head cane. "Now we discuss your real job." Marlowe's pulse hammered against her wrists, but she kept her voice level. "I thought my job was keeping Caspian functional." "That's the easy part. A trained monkey could organize a calendar and hide vodka bottles." Victor's gaze went distant, focused on something she couldn't see. "The hard part is keeping him alive. There's a threat against my family, Miss Ashford. Someone inside our organization is feeding information to our enemies. The attack will come soon, days not weeks. When it does, you'll need to be faster and smarter than everyone else in the room." The temperature in the cellar seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Marlowe forced herself to breathe. "You think whoever's coming will target Caspian? I think they'll target me, and my son will put himself between the bullet and my body. That's who he is, under all the violence and vodka, a weapon pointed at anything that threatens what's his." Victor's expression hardened. "Your job is to see the threat before he does, to pull him back before he gets himself killed being a hero." The weight of that responsibility settled on Marlowe's shoulders like a coat made of lead. She'd signed up to babysit a volatile heir, not to become a human shield against assassins. Victor must have read her face, because his voice dropped into something almost gentle. "Your brother gets his transplant regardless. The contract is solid. But if you walk away now, understand what you're walking away from, the chance to be more than someone who serves drinks and swallows insults. Your mother left the DeLuca family because she saw what that world does to people. She chose poverty over power. I'm offering you the opposite choice. Marlowe thought about Jasper's texts at 3 in the morning when the pain medications stopped working. About the bills stacked on their kitchen table like a house of cards built from desperation. About her mother's hands teaching her to read wine labels because Maria DeLuca had known somewhere in her dying bones that knowledge was the only inheritance that couldn't be gambled away or stolen. She met Victor's eyes. I'll keep him alive, but I need to know everything, who the enemies are, what the threats look like, all of it. Everything is a long list. Let's start with what matters. Victor gestured toward the elevator. Upstairs. There's someone you need to meet. The elevator climbed 43 floors in silence. When the doors opened, Caspian was awake despite the hour sitting at the windows overlooking Lake Michigan in darkness. He didn't turn when they entered. Victor's voice cut through the quiet. Tell her about your mother. Caspian went rigid. That's not... Tell her. She needs to understand what we're dealing with. The silence stretched until Marlowe thought it might snap. Then Caspian spoke without turning his voice flat, as hammered steel. I was 11. My mother was meeting a friend for lunch in Greektown. Simple, ordinary nothing that should have mattered. Someone planted C4 under the driver's seat of her Mercedes. Remote detonator. They waited until she was on the Eisenhower Expressway rush hour, surrounded by witnesses. Then they turned her into a fireball that made the evening news. Marlowe's throat constricted. They were trying to kill your father. They were sending a message that nobody in the Volkov family was safe, not even the non-combatants. That loyalty was a weakness they could exploit. Caspian finally turned, and his face was empty of everything except old rage. We never found who gave the order, but we found 6 people who helped, and we made examples that got written about in newspapers for weeks. Victor tapped his cane against the floor. The bombing was 16 years ago. Since then, we've had 3 attempted assassinations on me, 2 on Caspian, 1 on his cousin who now lives in Switzerland and never speaks to us. The threats come in cycles, quiet for months, then suddenly active. We're entering an active period now. The encrypted message Caspian received yesterday wasn't the first warning. Marlowe's mind raced through implications. You think it's the same people who killed Caspian's mother. I think it's someone who studied that playbook and decided to try again. The difference is that this time I have an advantage they don't know about. Victor looked at Marlowe with something that might have been calculation or might have been hope. You. Someone with no history in this world, no loyalties they can predict, no patterns they can track. You're an unknown variable, Miss Ashford. That makes you dangerous to them and valuable to me. The weight of being a chess piece in a game she didn't understand settled somewhere behind Marlowe's sternum. But she thought about the $70,000 that would save Jasper's life, about the apartment with heat that worked, and food in the refrigerator, about the choice her mother had made to walk away from power and die broke. She looked at Caspian, at the way he held himself like a weapon waiting for a target. What do you need me to do? Stay close, watch for anomalies. And when the attack comes... Victor's phone buzzed, cutting him off mid-sentence. He glanced at the screen and something cold crossed his features. It's starting. Warehouse meeting in River North, 30 minutes. Come armed. The Mercedes cut through Chicago's pre-dawn emptiness like a blade. Marlowe wedged between Caspian and a bodyguard who smelled like gun oil and stale coffee. Nobody spoke. Caspian checked his weapon with practiced efficiency, a matte black Glock that looked like it had seen significant use. And when he caught Marlowe staring, he pulled a second pistol from the console and offered it grip first. You know how to use this? Marlowe thought about her mother's lessons, not just wine, but survival. Maria DeLuca had taught her daughter to shoot in Indiana cornfields using bottles as targets and speaking in Italian so Ezra wouldn't understand if he overheard. The weight of the gun in Marlowe's hand felt simultaneously foreign and familiar, muscle memory from a dozen years ago surfacing like a ghost. Point and pull. Try not to hit friendlies. Caspian's mouth twitched. You're full of surprises. The warehouse squatted in an industrial zone where legitimate businesses died and got replaced by shells for money laundering. Floodlights mounted on the corners threw harsh shadows across gravel and Victor's men had already established a perimeter, 8 soldiers with rifles scanning rooftops and approach vectors with military precision. Victor's SUV pulled up simultaneously with theirs, and the old man emerged moving carefully, the wolf-head cane supporting weight that age and old injuries had made necessary. He nodded to Caspian, gestured toward the warehouse entrance. Inside smelled like concrete dust and something organic rotting in corners the light didn't reach. A table had been set up in the center, and around it sat 4 men Marlowe didn't recognize, union representatives based on their clothing, dock workers, with hands that looked like they could crush steel. Victor took the head of the table, Caspian to his right. Marlowe hung back near the entrance, watching the bodyguards, watching the shadows, trying to catalog everything her mother had taught her about reading situations where violence was always a possibility. The negotiations started. Routine percentages of shipments, payment schedules for services rendered the mundane logistics of moving illegal goods through legitimate ports. Marlowe's attention drifted to the windows, dark squares of glass that reflected the room back at itself, and that's when she saw it. A glint. Brief, high up from the warehouse across the street, moonlight catching on something that shouldn't be there at 4 in the morning. Her mother's voice crystal clear across the years. When something feels wrong, don't think. React. Marlowe's body moved before her brain caught up, launching across the 15 feet between the entrance and Victor's chair, tackling the old man sideways just as the window exploded inward. The bullet that would have entered Victor's skull punched through the chair back instead, scattering foam and fabric. The world became noise and motion. Bodyguards returned fire through the shattered window muzzle flashes, lighting the darkness. Caspian had his Glock out, covering his father as Marlowe and Victor hit concrete hard enough to knock breath from lungs. A second shot came from a different angle, another sniper-coordinated professional. It sparked off the metal table leg inches from Marlowe's face, and she rolled, pulling Victor with her behind a support column that might stop bullets or might just make them feel better about their chances. Caspian was moving, directing fire, his voice cutting through chaos. Rooftop northeast, second-floor windows, southwest, suppress and advance. The bodyguards responded like a machine, half laying down covering fire, while the others closed the distance to the exits. Marlowe stayed low, one hand on Victor's shoulder, the other wrapped around the pistol Caspian had given her. She'd never fired at a human being before. The thought sat in her stomach like swallowed glass. The snipers fell back, professionals who knew when a position was compromised. The gunfire stopped as abruptly as it started, leaving only the ringing in Marlowe's ears and the smell of cordite thick enough to taste. Victor pushed himself upright, breathing hard, and looked at Marlowe with eyes that had gone from ice to something approaching warmth. "You saved my life. You pay me to keep your son alive. Seemed like bad form to let you die instead." Her hands were shaking, adrenaline dumping into her bloodstream 3 seconds too late to be useful. Caspian appeared from the shadows, breathing controlled but elevated, sweat gleaming on his forehead despite the cold. He looked at the chair Victor had occupied at the bullet hole that would have been a skull, and his jaw tightened. "How did you see it?" "Window reflection. Light where it shouldn't be." Marlowe's voice sounded distant to her own ears, like someone else was speaking. "My mother taught me to watch for anomalies." Victor gripped her shoulder, his hand heavy and warm through her jacket. "Your mother taught you well. We owe you a blood debt, Miss Ashford. That's not something we say lightly." The bodyguards secured the warehouse, found 2 sniper positions, but no shooters. The professionals had extracted clean, leaving behind only brass casings and the knowledge that this had been coordinated, funded, and executed by people who knew exactly what they were doing. Marlowe sat on an overturned crate while Caspian checked her for injuries. She didn't have his hands clinical and efficient. When he was satisfied she wasn't bleeding, he sat beside her without speaking, and they watched Victor's men sweep the perimeter through the broken window. Finally, Caspian's voice came low enough that only she could hear. "You didn't hesitate. Most people freeze their first time under fire. I've had practice freezing. It never helped." Marlowe's hands had stopped shaking, but the adrenaline crash was building like a wave. "When my father came home drunk and angry, freezing just meant you got hit harder. Moving was survival." Caspian looked at her with an expression she couldn't parse, something between respect and curiosity, and maybe the beginning of trust. "You're not what I expected when my father hired a waitress to babysit me." You're not what I expected when I threw ice water in your face. Turns out we're both capable of surprises. Victor approached limping slightly, the cane bearing more weight than before. The snipers used encrypted communication, military-grade equipment. This wasn't the Odessa mob taking a shot. This was professional, well-funded, someone with access to intelligence about my schedule. He paused, looking between Marlowe and his son. Which means we have a leak. Someone inside our organization is feeding information to people who want me dead. The implications hung in the air like smoke. Marlowe's exhausted brain tried to process how many people knew about this meeting. 8. My 4 lieutenants, Caspian, myself, and 2 schedulers who coordinate logistics. Victor's expression hardened. One of those 8 either gave the information willingly or had it taken from them. Either way, we have a problem. Caspian stood pacing the length of the warehouse like a caged animal. We interrogate all of them. Find out who broke. Too obvious. Whoever's running this operation will have covered their tracks. Dead drops, cutouts, enough insulation that direct interrogation won't work. Victor turned to Marlowe. Which is where you come in. You're unknown to the organization beyond your role as Caspian's handler. That gives you access without suspicion. I need you to watch the lieutenants attend meetings, catalog who says what and to whom. The request settled in Marlowe's chest alongside the adrenaline and fear. You want me to be your spy. I want you to be our insurance, the person who sees the pattern before it kills us. Victor met her eyes. Can you do that? Marlowe thought about Jasper's transplant, about the money already deposited in accounts she'd never imagined having, about her mother choosing poverty over this exact kind of violence and how that choice had led to dying in agony while Ezra gambled away the morphine money. She looked at Caspian, at the way he watched her, with an intensity that suggested her answer mattered more than professional interest should allow. I can do that. But I need access to everything: financial records, communication logs, security footage. If there's a pattern, I'll find it. Victor smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. Welcome to the family, Miss Ashford. Try not to get killed before we finish the job. The drive back to the tower happened in silence. Marlowe's ears still ringing from gunfire, her hands sticky with Victor's blood from where she'd tackled him against concrete. Caspian sat close enough that their shoulders touched when the Mercedes took corners, and neither of them moved away. At the tower, Victor went to secure facilities to coordinate the investigation. Caspian and Marlowe rode the elevator to the 43rd floor, and when the doors opened, he grabbed her wrist before she could leave. Thank you. For my father. Marlowe looked at his hand on her wrist, at the scars that covered his knuckles from violence she could only imagine. It's the job. No, the job is keeping me sober and on schedule. What you did was... He stopped, searching for words. You put yourself between a bullet and someone you barely know. That's not the job. That's something else. She met his eyes, saw something in them she hadn't seen before. Vulnerability, maybe, or the beginning of the person beneath the violence. Your mother was killed by people who wanted to hurt your father. I won't let that happen again if I can stop it. Caspian released her wrist but didn't step back. My father was right about you. You're dangerous. Good. Dangerous keeps people alive. She left him standing in the hallway, took the elevator down 1 floor to her apartment, and stood under a shower hot enough to scald until the water ran clear and her hands finally stopped shaking. When she checked her phone, there were 3 texts from Jasper asking if she was okay, and one from a number she didn't recognize. Treatment approved. First appointment Monday 9 a.m. Dr. Chen. Marlowe sat on the edge of the bed that cost more than every piece of furniture she'd ever owned combined and let herself cry for exactly 3 minutes. Then she dried her face, called Jasper to tell him about Monday, and started making notes about the 8 people who knew Victor's schedule. Somewhere in that list was someone who'd tried to make her an orphan twice in one night. Finding them wasn't part of the job she'd signed up for, but keeping Caspian alive was. And right now those 2 goals pointed in the same direction. She worked through dawn, cataloging names and positions, building a framework for investigation. When exhaustion finally dragged her under, she dreamed about snipers and her mother's hands teaching her to read labels by kitchen light, and somewhere in the overlap, a pattern trying to surface. She woke at noon to pounding on her door. Caspian stood in the hallway holding 2 cups of coffee and looking like he'd slept as poorly as she had. "My father wants us at his estate, Lake Forest 40 minutes north, family council meeting." He handed her the coffee. "We're about to meet the people who might want us dead. Try to look friendly." The estate made the tower apartment look like a storage unit, 30 acres of manicured lawn rolling down to private beach. The main house a monument to old money and older violence. Security was visible and invisible cameras covering every angle, guards stationed at intervals that suggested military training. Inside, the decor ran to dark wood and oil paintings of men who looked like they'd crushed empires before breakfast. Victor waited in a study lined with books nobody had read in decades, and around a table that could seat 20 sat 4 men who radiated authority like heat. Victor made introductions. "Marlo Ashford, my son's new executive assistant. Gentlemen, meet Dmitry Katsaros, our liaison with the Greek shipping unions. Sergei Molotov, who runs our interests in the construction trade. James Halloran Alderman, and our voice in city government. And Sterling Crane, my consigliere." Marlo shook hands, memorized faces, cataloged details. Dmitry had dockworker hands despite the expensive suit. Sergei moved with the careful economy of someone who'd learned violence young and never forgotten. Halloran had politician's eyes that never quite focused on what they were looking at, and Sterling Crane, mid-40s, slicked hair, smile that never reached his eyes, watched her with an interest that made her skin crawl. "Pleased to meet you all." Marlo kept her voice neutral, professional, the waitress mask sliding into place. Sterling's smile widened. "I've heard quite a bit about you, Miss Ashford. Victor speaks highly of your organizational skills and your reflexes." The comment hung in the air just long enough to be uncomfortable. Caspian stepped closer to Marlo, a subtle shift that broadcast territoriality to everyone in the room. Victor tapped his cane for attention. "Last night's attack was sophisticated. Military precision, professional equipment, intelligence about my schedule that only 8 people possessed. One of you in this room either gave that information willingly or had it extracted. I intend to find out which." The temperature dropped 10 degrees. Dmitry's face flushed red. "You're accusing us of treason." "I'm stating facts. The leak exists. You're all suspects until proven otherwise." Victor's voice stayed level, conversational. "Miss Ashford will be conducting an independent audit of communications, finances, and movements for the past 3 months. You'll give her full access, or you'll give me a reason why not." Marlo felt 4 sets of eyes lock onto her, and the weight of that attention was physical. She met each gaze in turn, keeping her expression blank while her pulse hammered against her wrists. Sterling leaned back in his chair, still smiling. "An audit. How thorough. Miss Ashford, I look forward to showing you my records. They're meticulous." The way he said it made Marlo's stomach turn. She forced herself to nod. "I appreciate the cooperation." The meeting devolved into logistics, schedules for interviews, protocols for document review, security measures, while the investigation proceeded. Marlo took notes, aware of Caspian's presence at her shoulder like a shield, aware of Sterling's eyes tracking her every movement. When Victor dismissed them, Sterling caught her at the door. "A word, Miss Ashford." Caspian tensed. Victor nodded permission. Marlo followed Sterling into a side room that smelled like old cigars and newer money. Sterling closed the door, leaned against it, casual as poison. "You're in over your head. You understand that, right? This world has rules, and they're written in blood. People who ask too many questions tend to have accidents." Marlo kept her spine straight. "Is that a threat?" "It's friendly advice. Victor's protective of his new toys, but toys break, especially fragile ones." Sterling pushed off the door, closing the distance. "Your mother knew when to walk away. She left the DeLuca family because she was smart enough to see the cost. You might want to follow her example." The mention of her mother sent ice through Marlo's veins. "My mother died broke and in pain. I'm not interested in repeating her mistakes." "Then don't mistake survival for winning. You saved Victor's life last night. Congratulations, you're valuable. But valuable things get fought over, and you don't have the muscle to survive that kind of attention." Sterling smiled, and it was all teeth. "Walk away now while you still can. Take the money for your brother's treatment and disappear. It's the smart play." Marlo held his gaze, remembering her mother's hands, teaching her to read wine labels, teaching her to shoot, teaching her that knowledge was armor and silence was strategy. I appreciate the advice. I'll keep it in mind. She walked past him, opened the door, and found Caspian waiting in the hallway with an expression that suggested he'd heard every word through the door. They didn't speak until they were in the Mercedes heading back to Chicago. Then Caspian's voice came low and dangerous. "Sterling's the leak. You can't know that yet. I know he just threatened you. I know he's too confident, too comfortable while everyone else is nervous. And I know my instincts about people who smile like that." Caspian's hands flexed around nothing. "Give me 6 hours alone with him and I'll get the truth." Marlowe touched his wrist, felt the tension vibrating through muscle. "That's exactly what he wants, for you to make a move before we have proof. If he's the leak, he's covered his tracks. We need evidence, not confessions extracted through violence. Evidence takes time. Time means more attacks, more chances for my father to die. Then we make the time count." Marlowe pulled out her phone, started typing notes. "Sterling made a mistake. He knew about my mother's maiden name, about the DeLucas. That's not public information. Even Victor's background check wouldn't have that level of detail unless someone dug specifically into sealed family records. That means Sterling has resources beyond what a consigliere should have access to." Caspian looked at her with something approaching admiration. "You're already building the case." "I'm doing the job. Finding patterns is what I'm good at." They spent the drive back strategizing which records to request first, which questions to ask in what order, how to build a case without alerting Sterling that he was the primary target. By the time they reached the tower, Marlowe had a framework that might work if she was careful and lucky in equal measure. At her apartment, Caspian walked her to the door but didn't leave when she opened it. He stood in the hallway, backlit by recessed lighting, looking uncertain for the first time since she'd met him. "You didn't have to take this on. The spy work, the investigation. You could have just been my handler and collected the money." Marlowe thought about Jasper's appointment Monday, about the $70,000 that had bought her brother a future, about her mother's choice to walk away, and how that choice had led to exactly nowhere safe. "Your father offered me a chance to be more than someone who serves drinks. I'm taking it. All of it." Caspian nodded slowly. "Then watch your back. Sterling's dangerous, and if he's working for whoever tried to kill my father, he won't hesitate to remove obstacles. Neither will I." Something passed between them. Then, not trust, not yet, but recognition. Two people who'd learned survival in different schools but graduated with the same scars. Caspian left without another word. Somewhere in the night, Chicago kept turning, and Marlowe worked through dawn cataloging financial transactions and encrypted messages, watching for the pattern her mother had taught her to see. When sleep finally dragged her under at 6 a.m., she dreamed about Sterling's smile and sniper scopes and the way Caspian had stood between her and the door like a human shield, and she woke 3 hours later knowing exactly where to look next. The ledger sat in Marlowe's hands like evidence of her own execution pages filled with transactions that spelled out a story she didn't want to believe. She'd found it at 2 in the morning on her 8th day as Caspian's keeper, alone in Sterling Crane's office, while the consigliere attended a meeting in Milwaukee that Marlowe had confirmed through 3 independent sources. The office smelled like leather and expensive cigars, and the hidden compartment in the mahogany desk had been almost insultingly easy to find a false bottom that clicked open when she'd pressed the right corner. Inside, a second set of books. Not the clean records Sterling had shown Victor's auditors for a decade, but the real numbers. $15 million transferred over 18 months to something called IC Holdings, LLC, routed through Cayman accounts that existed only on paper. The LLC's registration documents sat beneath the ledger, and when Marlowe had seen the name on the incorporation papers, her stomach had tried to climb out through her throat. Isabella Catalano, her mother's full name, the one Maria DeLuca had buried when she'd fled New York at 19 and never spoken again. Marlowe photographed every page with shaking hands, the camera flash illuminating numbers that built a case she didn't understand. Why would Sterling embezzle Victor's money and route it through an account bearing her dead mother's name? The frame was perfect, airtight, the kind of setup that would make Victor believe Marlowe had been a plant all along. A DeLuca spy worming into the Volkov family's trust, stealing millions while pretending to be their savior. She'd just finished the last photograph when the office lights blazed on. Sterling Crane stood in the doorway, still wearing his travel coat, his smile the same predatory curve it had been at Lake Forest. Behind him, 2 security guards blocked the exit. "Looking for something, Miss Ashford?" Marlowe's hand went to her pocket where the phone sat warm with evidence, her mind racing through responses that wouldn't get her killed in the next 30 seconds. "Victor requested Q3 financial reports. You said I had access to your files. Q3 reports are in the main filing cabinet. That," Sterling gestured at the false bottom compartment still open on the desk, "is somewhere you needed a crowbar to reach, which suggests you weren't looking for reports." The guards moved into the room, flanking positions that cut off any path to the door. Marlowe stayed behind the desk, using furniture as a barrier, her pulse hammering against her eardrums. The compartment was already open. "I saw the ledger and thought it might be relevant to the audit." "Relevant. Yes, let's discuss relevance." Sterling walked to the desk, moving with the casual confidence of someone who controlled the situation completely. "That ledger shows $15 million transferred to an account owned by your mother, Isabella Catalano, sister of Don Salvatore DeLuca, who Victor's father killed in 1987. The same DeLucas who've been trying to reclaim New York territory for 40 years. He picked up the ledger, thumbed through pages like he was reading a menu. "The story writes itself, doesn't it? You infiltrate the Volkov family through Caspian, gain Victor's trust by staging a convenient sniper attack you just happened to spot in time. Then you systematically drain their accounts while framing me as the thief. Classic long con, Miss Ashford." "I'd be impressed if it wasn't so transparent." Marlowe's throat had gone dry, but she forced the words out level and clear. "You're lying. My mother cut all ties with the DeLucas 30 years ago. I didn't even know her maiden name until Victor told me. And yet here's an account in her name filled with Volkov money with transaction approvals that trace back to your personal laptop." Sterling pulled a folder from his coat, dropped it on the desk. "IP addresses, login credentials, timestamps, all pointing to you." The setup was elegant, thorough, exactly what Marlowe would have built if she'd wanted to destroy someone's credibility beyond recovery. She could see how it would play to Victor, the DeLuca bloodline surfacing after decades dormant, the convenient timing of her hiring the sniper attack that made her look heroic while distracting from systematic theft. Sterling circled the desk, getting close enough that Marlowe could smell his cologne mixing with cigar smoke. "Here's what happens next. You give me your phone, the one you've been using to photograph my files, and you walk out of this building. Disappear. Your brother keeps his treatment, your father stays clear of his debts. All you have to do is vanish and never contact the Volkovs again. And if I refuse, then I take your evidence to Victor tonight along with my evidence, and we see whose story he believes. A consigliere who's served him faithfully for 20 years, or a waitress with DeLuca blood who showed up 6 weeks ago." Sterling extended his hand, palm up. "Phone. Now." Marlowe's fingers closed around the device in her pocket, felt the weight of the photographs that proved Sterling's embezzlement and her own framing. Her mother's voice echoed across the years. "Sometimes survival means knowing when you're beaten." She pulled out the phone, looked at it for 3 seconds that felt like hours, then threw it at Sterling's face. He flinched, hands coming up, and Marlowe used that half-second to grab the crystal decanter from the desk and swing it like a club. The heavy glass caught Sterling across the temple with a sound like a bat hitting a watermelon, and he went down hard, blood immediately darkening his silver hair. The guards rushed her. Marlowe vaulted the desk, using momentum and surprise, drove her shoulder into the first guard's solar plexus before he could draw his weapon. He folded, gasping, and she grabbed the lamp from the desk and swung it in a wild arc that caught the second guard across the forearm. His gun clattered to the floor. She dove for it, fingers closing around polymer grip, but hands grabbed her ankles and dragged her backward. The first guard recovered enough to fight, hauled her upright, and slammed her against the wall hard enough to make her vision white out at the edges. When the world came back into focus, both guards had her pinned, and Sterling was pushing himself upright, blood streaming down the side of his face, his expression murderous. "Stupid girl. You just signed your own death warrant." He picked up the phone from where it had skittered across the floor, unlocked it with practiced ease. He'd watched her enter the code, she realized too late, and deleted the photographs with swipes that looked almost leisurely. Then he pulled out his own phone and made a call. "It's Crane. I need a cleanup crew at the downtown office. Subject is hostile resisting investigation. Authorization code Victor 7 Charlie." He hung up, wiped blood from his face with a handkerchief that probably cost more than Marlowe's monthly rent, and smiled through red teeth. "Victor will get a full report about how I caught his trusted assistant stealing from family accounts, how she attacked me when confronted, how I was forced to detain her for everyone's safety. The evidence is airtight, Miss Ashford. You're finished." Marlowe stopped struggling, went limp between the guard's hands, and let her voice drop into something quiet and deadly. "Victor will investigate. He'll find the truth. Victor will find exactly what I show him. I've been manipulating his perception of reality for 20 years. You think one waitress with delusions of competence can undo that?" Sterling leaned close, his breath hot against her ear. "Your mother was smart enough to run. You should have inherited her survival instinct." Before they dragged her out, Marlowe managed to send one text with her elbow against the phone in her back pocket, just 4 words to the number she'd memorized: "Sterling's office, now help." The cleanup crew arrived 10 minutes later, 4 men who moved with military precision and didn't ask questions. They zip-tied Marlowe's wrists, checked her for weapons, and found the folding knife her mother had given her a lifetime ago. One of them pocketed it without comment. Sterling gave instructions in clipped Russian that Marlowe's rudimentary understanding caught fragments of secure location, no communication, wait for further orders. Then he looked at Marlowe with something that might have been pity if it wasn't so calculating. "I almost liked you. You had potential real spine. But you're playing a game where the rules were written before you were born, and you never had a chance." They loaded her into a van with no windows and drove into Chicago's pre-dawn darkness while Marlowe's mind raced through scenarios that all ended with her dead or disappeared. The text she'd managed to send was a coin flip. At best it might reach Caspian in time, or it might get lost in the digital void while Sterling built his case and buried her in concrete. The van stopped after 40 minutes. When the doors opened, Marlowe saw an abandoned textile factory, the kind of South Side ruin that developers had been promising to renovate for decades while it slowly collapsed into rubble. They hauled her inside past machinery covered in rust and graffiti into an office that had been converted into something clinical and terrifying. Camera on a tripod, chair with restraints, table covered in tools that Marlowe's imagination didn't want to catalog. Sterling arrived 20 minutes later, bringing with him the smell of fresh coffee and the casual authority of someone who'd done this before. He positioned the camera, adjusted angles, checked lighting with the critical eye of a cinematographer. "I'm going to stream your confession to the Bratva dark web. Every family, every affiliate, everyone who needs to understand what happens to DeLuca infiltrators. Victor will watch his trusted assistant admit to everything. The embezzlement, the setup, the long-game attempt to destroy his organization from within." Sterling powered on the camera, the red light glowing like an eye. "And when you've served your purpose as an object lesson, someone else will finish what I started with Victor. His death will look like retaliation from the DeLucas, and the territory war that follows will leave Chicago ripe for new management." Marlowe pulled against the zip ties, felt plastic cut into wrists already bruised from the guard's handling. "Caspian will come for you. Caspian will watch the stream and realize his father's judgment was compromised by sentiment. He'll understand I did what was necessary." Sterling checked his watch, a Patek Philippe that cost more than Jasper's transplant. "We go live in 15 minutes. Time crawled. Marlowe's shoulders ached from the awkward angle of her bound wrists, and her mind kept circling back to Sterling's words, "Your mother was smart enough to run." Maria DeLuca had walked away from power and died broke and in pain, but she'd died free. She'd made her choice and lived with the consequences. But Marlowe thought about Jasper's treatment starting next week, about Caspian standing in the warehouse putting himself between bullets and his father, about Victor offering her a chance to be more than someone who swallowed insults for tips. She thought about her mother's other lesson, the one delivered in Indiana cornfields while teaching a teenage girl to shoot. Sometimes the only way out is through. The office door crashed open. Not Sterling returning, but chaos erupting in the factory beyond gunfire and shouting, and the distinctive sound of bodies hitting concrete. The guard stationed with Marlowe turned toward the noise, reaching for his weapon, and she lunged forward in the chair, using her legs to drive it into his knees. He stumbled, and Caspian appeared in the doorway like something conjured from violence and fury. He put 2 bullets in the guard's chest before the man could raise his gun, and the body dropped with the finality of meat understanding gravity. Caspian crossed the room in 3 strides, knife appearing in his hand, cutting through Marlowe's zip ties with efficiency that spoke of practice. His hands checked her for injuries, fast and clinical, and his eyes held something she'd never seen there before: actual fear. "Are you hurt?" "Bruised, scared, angry, not hurt." Marlowe's voice came out steadier than she felt. "How did you find me?" "Your text." 4 words was enough. Caspian helped her stand, kept one hand on her elbow when her legs proved unreliable. "We traced the cleanup crew's van, called in every favor Victor had with CPD. My father's outside coordinating extraction." More gunfire echoed from deeper in the factory. Marlowe's knees wanted to buckle, but Caspian's grip kept her upright. "Sterling has evidence. Fake ledgers showing I embezzled $15 million to an account in my mother's name. He's building a frame that makes me look like a DeLuca plant. We found his real files 2 hours ago. The ones showing he's been working for Odessa, embezzling systematically using your mother's identity as cover." Caspian's jaw tightened. "He tried to kill my father 16 years ago. He was the leak that got my mother killed, and he almost succeeded in finishing the job tonight." They moved into the hallway, Caspian leading with his weapon raised, clearing corners with practiced efficiency. Bodies lay scattered. Sterling's men neutralized with prejudice, and at the factory's loading dock, Victor waited beside an armored SUV, leaning heavily on the wolf-head cane. The old man's face shifted when he saw Marlowe, something that might have been relief cutting through the granite. He gestured them into the vehicle. "We need to move. Sterling fled when we breached. He's in the wind with intelligence that could destroy us." The SUV pulled away from the factory as dawn started bleeding into the eastern sky. Victor's voice came quiet, almost gentle. "Sterling showed me preliminary evidence 3 hours ago. Bank transfers, IP addresses, documents that looked legitimate enough that I questioned everything. If Caspian hadn't insisted we verify before acting, you'd be dead, and Sterling would be planning my funeral." Marlowe's hands shook with adrenaline crash. "He said he'd been manipulating you for 20 years. He was, successfully." Victor looked older than he had yesterday, the lines in his face carved deeper by betrayal. "Sterling Crane orchestrated my wife's death. He gave our enemies the intelligence they needed to plant that car bomb, and for 16 years I trusted him to help me grieve what he'd caused." The weight of that revelation settled in the SUV like a physical presence. Caspian's hand found Marlowe's squeezed once, then released. Victor continued. "He kept detailed records, every piece of intelligence sold, every operation compromised, every step of his plan to destroy our family and hand the territory to Odessa. But he made one mistake. He kept you alive long enough for us to find you." At the tower, Victor's lieutenants waited Dmitry Sergei Halloran, men who'd been suspects and were now reluctant allies in the hunt for the real traitor. They spread documents across the war room table, Sterling's actual ledgers showing millions funneled to Odessa, communication logs proving his coordination of the sniper attack, and property deeds revealing safe houses positioned throughout Chicago. "He's planning something bigger than just running." Victor tapped his cane against the floor. "The Odessa leadership arrives tonight for a family council I can't cancel without looking weak. Sterling knows I'll be there. He'll try to finish what the snipers started." Dmitry leaned forward. "We increase security, lock down the estate, make it a fortress." That's what he expects. Obvious security, predictable patterns. Victor looked at Caspian, then at Marlowe. "We'll give him predictable, and then we'll give him consequences." The plan came together in 20 minutes. Victor would attend the council with overwhelming visible security drawing every eye. Meanwhile, Caspian and a small team, including Marlowe, over Victor's initial objections that died when he saw the look in her eyes, would position as counter-snipers watching for Sterling's move. They had 6 hours to position assets and pray the trap would work. The Lake Forest estate blazed with floodlights by dusk, security checkpoints at every entrance, broadcasting paranoia loud enough that Sterling would read it from miles away. Marlowe rode with Caspian in an unmarked van parking 3 blocks out with sightlines to the estate's east wing where the council met. Caspian handed her a rifle sleek black with a scope that cost more than her old car. "You still remember what your mother taught you? Point at the right target, breathe, squeeze." Marlowe checked the weapon with hands that had steadied since the factory. "Try not to hit friendlies." They positioned on a roof with overlooking access, and Marlowe settled into the cold, watching through the scope as expensive cars delivered dangerous people to Victor's council. The old man appeared precisely on time, the wolf-head cane supporting his weight, surrounded by bodyguards who looked competent and completely unprepared for what Sterling had planned. An hour passed. Marlowe's fingers cramped on the rifle, her breath misting in November cold. Then Caspian's voice came barely above a whisper. "Movement. Northeast building, 3rd floor window, 2nd from left." Marlowe swung her scope, found the window, and saw its rifle barrel catching light as it positioned. Not one sniper, but 2 coordinated positions with crossfire on Victor's location. And between the 2 sniper positions visible through a different window, Sterling Crane watched through binoculars, orchestrating the death of the man who'd trusted him for 2 decades. Caspian's finger moved to the trigger. "On my count. 3, 2. The world exploded into sound and violence that Marlowe would remember in fragments, Caspian's rifle bucking against his shoulder, the window where Sterling stood shattering bodies moving in darkness. Victor's security erupting into coordinated response inside the estate, and through it all the cold understanding that this was the moment everything either ended or began again. Sterling went down, blood blooming on his shoulder, wounded but not dead. The snipers returned fire bullets sparking off concrete near Marlowe's position, and Caspian was moving, pulling her away from the edge, returning fire with controlled bursts. Then they were running downstairs and through alleys, racing toward the building where Sterling had fallen, where Victor's men were already converging like a closing fist. They reached the 3rd floor in time to see Sterling trying to crawl toward a window, leaving blood trails on hardwood, his shoulder a ruin, and his expression still defiant. Caspian put a boot on Sterling's good arm, pinning him. "It's over." "Is it?" Sterling coughed, blood flecking his lips. "The intelligence is already uploaded. Encrypted, time-delayed release. Kill me and it goes public. Every operation, every account, every corrupt cop and bought politician. The Volkov family burns either way." Victor arrived, moving faster than his age should allow, and looked down at the man who'd been his friend and his betrayer. The wolf-head cane pressed against Sterling's throat, not quite hard enough to crush. "You orchestrated everything. Claudia's death. You told them where she'd be." Sterling actually smiled through the blood. "Her death made you paranoid, controllable. Made you trust me absolutely because I helped you grieve." He coughed harder. "I've been killing you slowly for 16 years, Victor. Tonight was just supposed to be the final act." The cane pressed harder. Marlowe saw Victor's hand shake, saw decades of rage and grief trying to find release, and she understood that if Sterling died here it would be mercy. But Victor stepped back, lowered the cane, and his voice came out colder than winter. "You'll tell us how to stop the upload, and then you'll spend however many years you have left understanding exactly what you've lost." They extracted the encryption codes over the next 8 hours, Sterling's resistance breaking under methods Marlowe didn't witness and didn't ask about. Victor's technical people scrubbed the intelligence upload, and by dawn, the information that would have destroyed the Volkov family existed only in Sterling's fading memory. When there was nothing left to learn, they gave Sterling to the Odessa leadership as a traitor who'd played both sides. Whatever happened after that wasn't something anyone spoke about, but Sterling Crane never appeared in Chicago again. In the aftermath, Marlowe spent a week helping Victor's people audit every operation close, every vulnerability Sterling had created. She attended Jasper's first appointment at Northwestern Memorial, sat beside her brother while Dr. Chen explained the transplant procedure, and felt the weight of the $70,000 that had saved his life. 6 weeks later, she stood in the hospital while Jasper came through surgery successfully, the donor marrow already beginning its work. Her father called from rehab in Arizona sober for the first time in years, and Marlowe listened to Ezra's apologies with the understanding that some damage couldn't be undone but might be forgiven given enough time. 6 months after throwing ice water in Caspian Volkov's face, Marlowe walked into the Crimson Lounge wearing a suit that cost more than she used to make in 3 months. The November evening crowd was already thick, the smell of expensive liquor and expensive cologne mixing with jazz piano that drifted through speakers hidden in the ceiling. Every head turned when she entered. Not because she was beautiful, though the tailored black suit did things for her that waitress uniforms never had, but because power had a frequency people recognized even when they couldn't name it. A young waitress, maybe 19, was clearing tables near the VIP section when her tray slipped. Glass shattered on imported marble vodka, spreading in pools that caught the light, and the girl froze with the universal expression of someone watching their employment evaporate. The manager, not Paulie anymore, he'd been replaced after Sterling's takedown, rushed over, face already red. "Consigliere Ashford, I'm so sorry, I'll have her." Marlowe raised one hand, stopping him mid-sentence. She crossed to where the girl stood shaking, picked up one of the unbroken glasses from the wreckage, and handed it to her. "What's your name?" "Nina." The girl's voice barely made it past her teeth. "Nina Volkov. I'm Victor's niece. First week on the job." Marlowe studied her, saw the family resemblance in the ice-blue eyes and the way she held herself despite the fear. She remembered standing in almost this exact spot 8 months ago, bleeding from Caspian's backhand, making a choice that had led to everything that came after. "Nina, when you drop something, you clean it up and keep moving. You don't apologize to men who enjoy your fear. You don't let one mistake define your value." She gestured to the mess. "Clean this, then get back to work." The girl's eyes widened with something between relief and confusion. "Yes, consigliere, thank you." Marlowe walked to the VIP section, to the crescent booth that had been Caspian's territory the night everything changed. He was already there, not drunk and violent, but composed, reading a contract with a glass of water, not vodka, at his elbow. He stood when she approached, pulled out her chair with a gesture that was respect rather than chivalry, and waited until she sat before taking his own seat. 6 months had refined the rough edges violence had carved into him. He was still dangerous, would always be dangerous, but now the danger was controlled, channeled, a weapon that knew when not to fire. "How's Nina doing?" His mouth quirked. "I heard glass breaking." "She'll be fine. She's got the bloodline for it." Marlowe accepted the vodka. He poured Russian Standard Platinum, the bottle that had started everything. "Your father wants us in Lake Forest tomorrow. Something about expansion into the Southside territories. He wants your opinion on strategy. You've become his favorite advisor." Caspian raised his water glass. "To the woman who tamed the Bratva heir by throwing ice water in his face." "I didn't tame you. I matched you." Marlowe clinked her glass against his. "There's a difference." They drank, and through the windows Marlowe could see Chicago sprawling into evening, a city she'd served drinks in and now helped shape. 6 months ago she'd been drowning in debts and desperation, swallowing insults for tips, watching her brother die slowly while her father gambled away his conscience. Now she sat in the VIP section of the Crimson Lounge as Victor Volkov's consigliere, the first woman to hold that position in Bratva history. She'd survived Sterling Crane's betrayal, proven her loyalty in blood and fire, and earned a seat at the table where decisions got made. Her mother had chosen to run from this world, to trade power for poverty and die free. Marlowe had chosen to stand her ground, to claim power and wield it with the understanding that every choice carried weight. She didn't know yet which choice was right. Maybe there was no right answer, just different ways of surviving in a world that broke people for sport. But watching Caspian review contracts with the focused intensity he'd once reserved for finding things to destroy, seeing Nina clean up broken glass with her spine straight and her head high, Marlowe thought maybe survival didn't have to mean running. Maybe sometimes it meant standing your ground and daring the world to move you. Caspian set down his contract, looked at her with eyes that had gone from ice to something warmer, and spoke the words that had become their private language. "Checkmate, consigliere Ashford." Marlowe smiled, tasting vodka and victory, and the beginning of something neither of them had names for. Yet, the game's just starting, Caspian Volkov, and I don't plan on losing. Outside, November wind rattled windows and made the floodlights sway. Inside the Crimson Lounge, two people who'd met through violence and ice water sat as equals, planning tomorrow's moves in a game that never really ended. 6 months ago, Marlowe had been invisible. Tonight, she was inevitable. And that made all the difference.